David Shoebridge is going to have a conversation with you guys. David is a senator, was previously a member of the New South Wales Parliament until a few years ago now, moved to the Senate federally, and he is going to speak to us about the Canberra's perspective, looking down from, is it down? Down from Canberra, about where, across from Canberra, over from Canberra, about where things are up to. I like that he's put some thought into the name of his talk. It's Waiting for Canberra, I should say. David is well known for many things, but one of the things he's well known for is being the first and so far only politician to attempt to introduce a federal law that would legalise cannabis. So well done, didn't get very far, but anyway, great idea. Legally sound idea as well, but anyway, so I should say that. So an active member of the Canberra fraternity known as Politicians. The topic, Waiting for Canberra, a comedy in many acts, or why are we still having this conversation?
Oh yeah, thanks very much, Steve, and thanks everyone for coming here to MardiGrass to be literally doing this once a year plan about how to, well, legalise cannabis for the entire country, but how to also change the conversation and what do we do to get us down that pathway. And I suppose I want to begin by acknowledging we're here on Bundjalung land, and you all know as you look out at the country around here what a pretty precious part of the world this is. And you know, as a Green senator, I get to travel the whole country and see First Nations communities, country, care for country all across this extraordinary place that we all call home. And there are a few places more magical than Bundjalung land, although there's competitors. But I think we should all take a collective moment to recognise this is First Nations land and also recognise that the laws against cannabis also so often are laws against First Nations peoples. You know, the drug laws, whether it's drug driving, stop and search, possession laws, they're weaponised against poor people, they're weaponised against First Nations communities, they're weaponised in regional parts of our country, but particularly First Nations peoples are at pretty much the front line of this war on drugs. And I'm coming to you actually from a trip that I've just had for a Senate inquiry into youth justice. And we're up in Darwin in the Northern Territory, and then we went across over to a place called Groote Island. And this isn't a geography test, but Groote Island, it's actually the fourth biggest island in Australia, and it's just off, if you can picture Arnhem Land and the Gulf of Carpentaria, Groote Island is just off to the east of Arnhem Land in the Gulf of Carpentaria. And the First Nations community there have one of the most distinct languages on the planet, a really distinct language and a very clear, identifiable culture. And they have been fighting to keep their kids from being sucked up into the brutal Northern Territory youth justice system. And they're relying on cultural strengths and cultural connections to country. And they've been incredibly successful at it, fighting a government that wants to take their kids and brutalise their kids. And they've been keeping their kids on ground. But one of the other things that became really clear as we spent time on Groote Island is First Nations community on Groote Island have a quite strong connection with cannabis. And they oppose alcohol coming onto their country because they can see the violence that it causes. But cannabis has a kind of cultural acceptance amongst First Nations communities there. And what they find themselves in this repeated conflict with the Territory Police, who have, you know, when I got off the plane on my Air North flight from Darwin to Groote Island, as I got off, all the drug dogs came. And you know, Groote Island Airport is not a flashy airport, right? It's really just a shed. And a big pot of international roast and Milo. But they managed to find the resources also for drug dogs to be sitting there and screening everyone's luggage as you come in, and it's to find cannabis and just this war on cannabis. And so the community then end up getting criminalised, getting caught up in the criminal justice system, having this ongoing negative interaction with police, and also spending a huge amount of their money on getting incredibly expensive of unknown quality cannabis from organised crime groups that actually then profit from the community on Groote Island. We sometimes think that this is a struggle here in the Northern Rivers or it's a struggle in Sydney. It's actually a struggle all across this country. And the communities that are too often at the front line of it are First Nations communities. So if for no other reason than to step along the pathway to truth, justice and treaty, let's legalise cannabis for Groote Island and other places. Steve, you're allowed to chip in whenever you want.
I will. So I guess the question is prospects for change, nationally speaking. From the federal government perspective, it's a common theme, I suppose, that MardiGrass is over the year, up to 34 apparently. What's Canberra going to do? Is Canberra going to follow Washington? Are we still following the American policy? Is that helping or not helping?
Well, we'll follow Washington into a war. We seem to be doing that right now. We'll follow them into an arms contract. We'll follow them into supplying weapons into create a genocide and push a genocide in Palestine. We'll follow them into giving them cover for an invasion in Lebanon or Iran, but we won't follow Washington into legalising cannabis or removing federal offences. And in fact, one of the interesting things the federal government in Washington has done is actually remove a number of the federal cannabis offences in order to not have a conflict between federal and state laws, because about half the states in the United States have legalised cannabis at a state level. And it was in the dying days of the Biden administration, I think he realised it was popular, they removed some of the federal laws which made it a crime to move cannabis between states and some of the federal possession offences. It was incredibly popular, not popular enough, it turns out, for Biden, but it was incredibly popular. And yeah, so it does rather frustrate me. We'll follow the US to war, but we won't follow them to this kind of peaceful taking, the steps towards legalising cannabis and letting states get on with legalising cannabis. And we have a little bit of that conflict in the Federation here at the moment, because the ACT has been really quite successful in about 4 years ago now. They decriminalised cannabis possession and they decriminalised growing up to 4 plants?
2 or 4, I don't know. I don't live there, so I don't have to know.
Yeah.
But it's 2 or 3 or 4. It's
Let's say 3. It's not 3, it's either 2 or 4. But anyhow.
Anyone who's going to with ACT, though, speak to a lawyer before you go.
Yeah, don't plant your third
plant. Don't take our word for it.
2. There you
2,
go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, these magistrates are useful.
Yeah,
so you can grow 2 without being prosecuted. You can have possession of cannabis without being prosecuted for a criminal offence. I think the police will still have the power to confiscate it, and you give you like a parking ticket. And then about 2 years ago, the ACT also decriminalised the possession of other illegal drugs. So again, it's not legal, but you don't go to jail if you're in possession of a small amount of personal possession of any drug in the ACT. Now, I remember at the time when the ACT were changing these laws, there was a lot of push for the Australian Federal Police, who have a kind of dual role in the ACT. They enforce ACT territory laws, but they're also responsible for enforcing Commonwealth laws at the same time, the Australian Federal Police. It's not like New South Wales, where you have a very distinct police force. We have a state police force doing state laws, and then the AFP, the Australian Federal Police, doing federal laws here. In the ACT, the AFP do both. Sort of separate commands, but they do both. And there was a lot of push from the Coalition in particular, and One Nation, for the Australian Federal Police to go and start charging people in the ACT with Commonwealth drug possession offences, and to use the Commonwealth laws to try and monster people in the ACT. There's been resistance from that inside the AFP, because I think they realise what a nightmare it would be. But there is still that tension between federal and state laws in the ACT. And yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, but the good news, really, the good news of that part of the story is, pardon me, is that the policing are not, the federal police are not arresting people, charging people for possession. So even though they do have a theoretical, at least legal power to do that, they are not doing that. So yes, there is some pressure about it, but so far so good. And the AFP said, no, we're not going to, don't worry about it. If you've got a joint in your pocket, if you're smoking a joint, we're not going to walk in the corner and bust you for that. But
bust you with
otherwise, it's a little bit, Anyway.
it's kind of working out rationally. But I remember...
Yeah. What's your hope?
I remember Senator Michaela Cash, who was the opposition Attorney General spokes.
She was good.
Good in a kind of, Rottweiler trying to attack a kitten kind of good way. She was viciously against, from the coalition side, the ACT doing this. And I remember her saying in the Senate, we had a debate, they put a motion up, the coalition put a motion up to hate on the ACT, decriminalising cannabis and then decriminalising other drugs. And she said, if this law passes, next time I come to Canberra, there's going to be the Lake Burley Griffin is going to be full of party boats, full of drug-using youths who will be coming like a mecca from all over the country into these party boats on Lake Burley Griffin, and people will be falling off them, drunken and, on cannabis. I think maybe she had her coalition party room in her brain, I don't know. But it actually turns out that sadly hasn't happened. Lake Burley Griffin is still as boring as it was 2 years ago. There are no party boats full of national drug tours happening on Lake Burley Griffin. The sky is firmly there in the ACT. And what's really good is no one's going to jail for the possession of drugs in the ACT. And that's a win. So we should celebrate the wins. That's a win.
The Make Canberra Fun Again crowd were a bit disappointed that Michaela's prediction didn't come true, but nonetheless.
I want to give a shout out to our Greens team there who were critical. They're in the balance of power and they worked really long and hard to get those laws through, often against a bunch of resistance. It goes to show how, sometimes we get frustrated with a political project, but having the right numbers in the right place at the right time pushing can get this stuff through.
Look, David, the other question I'd like to ask you is this one, and again, it's a favourite, perennial, really, question at MardiGrass. So, obviously, there are obstacles in the way of law reform. Why are we still talking about this? It's been years and years and years that all the sensible, rational arguments have been made. Who needs convincing in this room? Nobody. But why is it that we still have not been able to... Why is it so intractable, so persistent? What are the main obstacles do you see? Obviously, a lot of it is state politics, state law, up to the state government, the state parliaments and state governments, leaders, to give some leadership on the issue, you'd like to think. But from a federal perspective, what do you reckon? What are the obstacles from a federal perspective? And you can speak about the states, of course, as well. Yeah,
well, across the country, one of the reasons we're not getting sensible drug law reform is because there's a kind of codependency between organised crime and the police and the security agencies. They kind of need each other. Organised crime need crappy laws to make things illegal so that their product can only be sold by them at a premium. So organised crime love this. Great for organised crime. And police and security agencies, they need the illegal drug laws so that they can have the resources and the manpower and the staffing and the surveillance powers, you've seen the amount of resourcing they've got just to police MardiGrass. That doesn't come out of nowhere. The only reason they had all of those, 100 police and the equipment and the powers and the resources was because of crap drug laws, right? So there is a codependency between the security agencies and organised crime. And in fact, I was just having a look, the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, the sort of federal organised crime fighting body that's been established, they do this thing called a wastewater survey every year. So they screen everyone's, the major sewage systems in the country.
There are no secrets.
Yeah, it's a pretty glamorous job doing the sewage screening. They screen all the sewage, the big sewage outfalls, and they test them to see how much, of different drugs are in the wastewater. They know how many people are crapping into toilets that are going into the system. Therefore, they can work out by the amount of drugs in the system what the sort of annual consumption is of different drugs in their areas. And just a funny anecdote, I live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney near Bondi Junction. And this will surprise you, the outfall there in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, when the first 2 years they did the wastewater study, they had these graphs for, different amounts of drugs that are used, and, this much cannabis in off the eastern suburbs of Sydney, this much methamphetamines, this much MDMA, and they couldn't fit the amount of cocaine in on the standard graph. And they had to come up with some new ways of showing the amount of cocaine per capita in the eastern suburbs of Sydney.
See over the page for the rest of the graph.
It was so, they've worked it out now. They've got a new way of showing the cocaine use. But of course, where are police resources being focused on the war on drugs? Not in Double Bay, not in Bondi Junction, not in Randwick, but in Campbelltown and Lismore and Nimbin, right? It's such an obvious class / race / social project, the way they police drugs. And you can see it if you compare where drugs and the type of drugs are being consumed and where police resources are being used. But like the most recent survey was basically an admission of defeat. Because it only came out on Wednesday. So if anyone wants to Google this, you can have a look. They've got some nice graphs and images. It's actually an interesting read. But what they said was, in the last year, so when they did the survey last year, they estimated that just the 4 drugs, this is methamphetamine, cocaine, MDMA and heroin, they estimated the street value of those drugs that was consumed across the country last year, and it was a record $11.5 billion, right, last year. So that's $11.5 billion going into organised crime. No wonder organised crime like the drug laws. But this year, all of the drug use in those 4 drug types has exploded, and they estimate the street value was $14.3 billion consumed in the last year of just those 4 types of drugs. And actually, when you look at the numbers, cannabis has plateaued and slightly reduced, although it's still far and away the most commonly consumed illegal drug in the country. It's plateaued or reduced, and we could talk about why that is, but anecdotally, and when you're talking to people, one of the reasons is cannabis is easily identified in roadside drug testing. It's easily identified if you're working in an industry that's going to test you on a Monday, and so there's been this, for many people, there's been a translation away from cannabis, which is being policed in this way, towards drugs that are unquestionably more dangerous, such as methamphetamines. And you can actually see this sort of playing out now in this national drug data. So what does the Australian government do with that data? They sort of get awkwardly embarrassed by it and move on to the next item. Yep.
Just one point on that point is that I was just looking the other day at the random drug testing results for New South Wales, and for a few years now, it's been that there's a higher level of detection of methamphetamine than for THC. There are more people who get testing positive. It's not that far apart. They're pretty close, but there's a bit of a gap, and the little bit of a gap is in favour of higher than for methamphetamine. So, to the extent that there's some random benefit, or exercise, so it's just showing, the prevalence, I suppose, of some drug use in some communities. Anyway, just saying.
And that survey was the National Wastewater Survey by the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission. Sorry if that's a mouthful, but you can do ACIC wastewater, and that'll take you to the survey with all the graphs. And it just shows you that someone's winning the war on drugs. It's just not the police. And it's not us.
Look, we have questions, I'm sure, from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, please put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. We're recording all of this conversation and commentary and so on. And also, people won't hear you unless you got the microphone. So just put your hand up, wait for the microphone to come to you, and then fire away with your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Shoebridge, so you were saying how there's a lot of incentive, say, like federal police and other executive arms of government to continue this war on drugs because they get funding. And of course, it's a bit of a sentiment you might find with police. They love the fact that they're busting people for drugs. How would you say their influence in, say, the legislative or parliament generally is maybe overstepping, in the sense of, are they like persuading, MPs to continue the war on drugs? And how could we maybe maintain that separation of powers where you would think there's prejudicial attitudes making its way into Parliament because of the executive arms of government?
Yeah, I mean, really good question. Like the police they try and pretend they're part of the justice system, but they're not, right? They're part of the government and they're part of the executive government, and they're meant to be held in check by the justice system and by Parliament. So there's, three parts of government. You've got, of our system of government, you've got the executive, which is all the government departments and the bureaucrats. Then you've got the Parliament, which is meant to make the laws and agree to fund the executive. And those two things are critical. And then hopefully hold them to account when they breach the laws or waste the money or whatever. And then you've got the justice system, the courts, which is meant to interpret the laws and hold everybody, politicians, police, whoever, hold everybody, to account under the rule of law. So that's how it's meant to work. But, in my experience in state parliaments in particular, the MPs couldn't distance themselves from the police. They kind of saw the police as an extension of their political power, and they didn't realise actually their job was to pass laws. Parliament's job is to pass laws and to fund, and then to hold the government to account, and that includes the police. But instead they really identified themselves with the police, and you see this with the Labor Party, you see it with the Coalition, you see it with One Nation. They really identify themselves with the police, and that's crazy dangerous in a democracy, because the police already have a huge amount of power over us, because Parliament's given them a bunch of power: stop and search, interrogate, get a warrant, go through your property. Like, police got heaps of power, and it's Parliament's job to hold them to account, particularly when they abuse the power. Now, it's not quite as dominant at a federal level, because the Australian Federal Police, per capita, there's a lot less AFP officers than there are state and territory police, right? But increasingly, what we've seen in the last 2 and a bit decades, at a federal level, is a love affair between the Labor Party, the Coalition and One Nation, and police and ASIO and security agencies, whether it's under the guise of the war on terror, or they're trying to politicise protest, or they're trying to stop us organising collectively. You see this increasing identification between the politicians and these security agencies. And if you want Exhibit A for that at the moment, there's a law working its way through the federal parliament. It's called the ASIO Bill Number 2. All right, the ASIO Bill Number 2, 2026. And the ASIO Bill Number 2 is a really nasty piece of legislation. After 9/11, and the terrorist attacks in New York, there was these extraordinary powers given to ASIO, where they could literally, without having to be troubled by going to a court or a magistrate or a judge, they could get a warrant signed by a politician, in this case the Attorney General, and with that warrant, they could whisk you off the street, take you away to secret interrogation for 24 hours. If you don't if you don't cooperate with them, you can go to jail for up to 5 years. Once they've got you in their detention, if you don't answer all of their questions, regardless of whether you've got rights against incrimination or privacy or the like, you can go to jail for up to 5 years. You can bring a lawyer with you, but if they think the lawyer's annoying them, they can kick the lawyer out at any point in the first 24 hours. And then if you tell then they will then spit you out after 24 hours of questioning. And if you tell anyone where you've been, you tell them that you've been questioned, you tell them what you got asked, you mention any of this to anybody, you can also go to jail for up to 5 years. Now, those laws were brought in at a sort of panic after 9/11, as though we needed these laws. Oh, and they can do it to 14-year-olds as well. Do it to kids. They were brought in a panic, but they always had this sunset clause in them, which said they expire every 3 or 4 years, because you don't want those kind of laws sitting permanently on the statute books. Because you can imagine a government abusing those laws. Of course you could. The Attorney General signing warrants to get people he or she didn't like off the street and interrogate them secretly and monster them. Of course they can be abused. They could well have been abused to date, but we won't know because it's all secret. No one's been able to talk about it. And the Labor Party has now brought some legislation in to remove the sunset provision and to make these laws permanent. And who would hand those powers permanently to any future government? It is so utterly dangerous. And then in the most obscene hypocrisy you can imagine, you can go online and see Anthony Albanese, what's his job now, Steve? I'm trying to remember. Anthony Albanese?
Say again?
Anthony Albanese, what's his job?
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, that's right.
He's the boss.
Yeah, you can see him online in 2003 when these laws were first brought in, saying these laws are really dangerous. They could be used by a fascist government. They could be used to take down their political opponents. They should never be brought in. They should not be permanent and they should not go on the statute books. That's what he said in 2003. Now he's the Prime Minister, he wants to make them permanent. Yeah, this love affair between the Labor Party, One Nation and the Coalition and these security powers to the police and ASIO and others, it is incredibly dangerous and it threatens all of our liberties.
Question at the back, I think.
Oh, yeah, here we go.
Middle, sorry.
Yes, okay, David. I come from a third-generation Labor Party family. I now support the Greens, and I guess one question I have is why there is so much, I don't know, conflict, hatred, almost hatred, some elements of the Labor Party against the Greens. That's my first question. What have you done to provoke that? No,
Exist.
The second question is, and it relates to this hypersecurity and freedom of information. And I am a follower of the development of AI, and our Defence Department is signing up with Palantir, which is basically an agreement to share much of our data with the same company that is run by, I don't know, is it Thier or Musk, one of those billionaires, that controls ICE, the homeland people in the United States, and the prisons there, and the surveillance that involves. I'm wondering, what can the Greens do?
I said to Steve and Kathleen that given there's a lot of shit going on at the moment, it's likely this session would move around from cannabis to other things. And I think it's, we're asking these questions, the same system that's failing to do the right thing on cannabis law reform and take away these powers is doing a bunch of other similarly bad things. You asked me about the Labor Party, why they hate on the Greens. It's because they see us as a threat to their business model and they're aggressively against us. And I was in state parliament for a decade. I've been in the federal parliament since 2022. And, I suppose when I initially came in, there was a bit of my brain that thought, well, maybe if we give Labor the opportunity, right? If we get the Greens in the balance of power, we have enough Greens in the place so that between us and them, we can do good stuff, that they'll take the opportunity, at least occasionally, take the opportunity to do something good. That has not worked. Like they do not have an interest in, right at the moment, taxing gas multinationals so as we can all have the resources we need to go to hospital when we need it or buy a house. They're not going to do that, it looks like, giving in to the big global gas corporations. That we gave them an opportunity to legalise cannabis. And they threw it back in our face and attacked us for it. Attacked us. And made political attacks against the Greens, saying we wanted to give kids cannabis or whatever. It's bullshit lies from them. They've turned it into an attack vehicle against us. When we want to get funding for public housing, they weaponise it against us. They don't have an interest in working with us to deliver on good projects because they don't have an interest in the good projects. And it's not as though there's a bunch of them in there desperately wanting to do good and just waiting for the opportunity in the moment. They now are signed on to the agenda, which is giving corporations more power, giving gas corporations more access to our resources, giving security agencies more powers, because they believe in it. And they are as much a part of the problem as One Nation or the Coalition, in my mind, to the kind of progressive hopes that we have for this country. So, you know, and that's why they hate us, because we're actually fundamentally against their project. And they will do what they can to wipe the Greens out. And we're not going anywhere. And I personally think the space in the left is growing for us to take advantage and actually not you know, make them better, but replace them. And that's the job going forward. Oh. You said Palantir, right? Put your hand up who likes Palantir. Like, if you wanted global evil, you know, there it is. We share on social media images of Palantir, and we're trying to work out what the backdrop image should be for Palantir. And the only one that really works and tells the story is the Eye of Sauron, right? It kind of works. And it's in their name, you know? And Palantir is this US multinational controlled by a bunch of like really hard right billionaire types. Peter Thiel is one of the big funders of them.
Bond villains.
They are literally Bond villains, only they're there in full image. And Palantir just published a manifesto. Like, they're an IT company or an AI company. They do data management and AI mining of data. And they just published a manifesto where they basically said, well, you know, the IT industry has an obligation to work with the US on building automated killer robots. And we have to do that. And we have an obligation to fund and support the US military. And then they said, and we should be very clear that there are superior and inferior cultures. And, you know, white Western culture is superior, and these other ones we're not going to specify, but maybe we're having a war with them, you know, are inferior. And they just said it. They didn't hide it. They literally just said it. So what does our government do? What does the Labor Party do? They sign contracts with Palantir to give them access to our Defence Department, to give them access to some of the security agencies, including our Signals Directorate, our secret National Signals Directorate. The Victorian Labor government just signed a contract with them to give them access to prison data. Like, we shouldn't be signing contracts with these guys. We should be legislatively banning them from the country and trying to get some data sovereignty. But, you know, this isn't by accident. It's kind of by design, and it's bloody scary.
Question down the front.
Working.
I was very excited by your bill that you put up and very disappointed it didn't pass. Where do we go from here? Are we going to just try to reintroduce that bill, try a different approach, wait for a while?
Yeah, good question. So in 2023, we had drafted a bill and started consulting on a bill to legalise cannabis for the whole country. It actually, the best opportunity is to do it federally, because then you can legalise cannabis for the whole country, and then you can also persuade politicians to get on board by putting a cannabis sales tax on, you know, and providing a funding stream instead of going to organised crime, going to hospitals and schools and, you know, public transport. It got literally Labor turned it into an attack on us, saying that, you know, we basically wanted to give free drugs to kids. You know, this sort of really cartoonish-like attack that came from Labor and from the Coalition and from One Nation. One Nation voted against it and hated it as well. And it was all the same. We could have been in 1957, you know. The same tropes came out about drugs are bad. You know, this is an entryway to giving the entire nation a heroin habit. Like, all these bullshit arguments that have been totally debunked came out. I was hopeful that, because the federal parliament is not owned by the police in the same way as states and territories, that we would have more room and a better debate. The debate was no better federally than it is state and territory. So we are now looking at what we can do, which is kind of smaller chunks and smaller bites, achievably at a federal level, getting rid of a couple of the federal offences and start a trend. So some of the federal possession offences to open the door to create a more permissive approach for states and territories to move, so we don't have the ACT problem. And focusing on getting rid of that conflict with the ACT is a good starting point. And funding some trials around the country. Trials on, you know, for regions or areas or industries in the sort of legalised cannabis. And I think we're working up a couple of packages to sort of take us a step closer to legalisation in this parliament. And then, I don't know, let's wait and see what the shape of the next parliament is. We've got more power in the next parliament. We can bring back the full package. But in this parliament, that's what we're looking at the moment, to keep the momentum going, to keep the engagement. Yep.
Any other hands up? The word before? Yeah. It's very in the middle. We can't see. There's a light in the right. Sorry.
Thanks. I hope you don't mind me asking another question. So, in terms of like what voters can do and everyday consumers, because our powers eventually will ultimately come down to voting and what we can and cannot purchase. A lot of these kind of oppressive laws, there's always a lobby behind them. So when it comes to, say, the marijuana or like the bills that you're putting through and they're getting voted against, who would you say from your experience in Parliament and say, funding the lobby against it? In my mind, I can think of maybe alcohol. And is there any specific corporations or groups that represent these corporations we can somehow, maybe as consumers or at least voters, not support?
Yeah. I mean, which are the obvious industries to lose if we legalise cannabis? Well, you got the security industries. They sometimes go under the name of police, but you've got the security industry and the harm industry. That's one of them. You have the alcohol industry, which would be big losers. You look at the data coming out of the US, and there is a very clear translation in some people's consumption, reducing alcohol use and in part translating that to cannabis use, which pretty much every public health official will tell you is a net public health gain when you have that translation. And then also the pharmaceutical industry. And it was interesting how, as we presented our bill, the Australian Medical Association, they had a fresh election just before our bill, the closing for submissions of our bill. And, the Australian Medical Association has a close relationship at different times with the pharmaceutical industry. They had an election. Then the new head of the AMA came in and put a submission in attacking legalising cannabis. In a shamefully badly researched, in many ways deliberately inaccurate submission, which cited false data and false conclusions out of data they put to attack our bill coming from the Australian Medical Association. And when we pointed out to them their abuse of their sources and their misquoting of sources, they refused to correct it. So yes, alcohol, pharmaceutical and security industries are the key ones. But there's also just, like, politicians weaponise the drug debate to create fear and to attack their political opponents regardless of the evidence. We saw that too. Yep.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's exactly the question that I want to ask you, Dave.
Just a bit close to your mouth, my friend. That might be not on.
Okay, David, yeah, well, I'm glad you got it back to the fear tactics because it sort of reverts to my earlier question about the strategies that the Green Party needs to neutralise or combat or confront or deal with the fear tactics, which has been the main, I guess you say, the main weapon of fascism since time began, or since fascism began. And how do you deal with the fear tactics in your rhetoric, the way you frame legislation, the way you debate in the Parliament? How do you overcome the fear tactics? And, okay, you can talk about the media if you like.
Well, I'd love to pretend that if you presented the right argument in Parliament, you'd persuade people around the Parliament to do the right thing. That is not how parliaments work. It's not a merit-based debate that happens on the floor of Parliament. The party positions are locked in when they meet with stakeholders or schmoozers or industry representatives. They lock those positions in and then they'll say any crap on the floor of the Parliament to justify their position. That's what happens. what I do think is the last 3 years have seen, I think, people beginning to understand just how much of what we've been told and keep getting told is pretty much a lie based on fear. And I think people have seen our governments try and justify the unjustifiable. In the last, 3 years in particular, they've seen our government soft pedal on a genocide in Gaza, and they've seen the reality of it, and they can't believe what our government has done. They can't believe they haven't condemned it. They can't believe they haven't put sanctions on. They can't believe we put weapons in. And they can see for themselves the reality of the obscene conflict in Gaza and what it's doing to kids in particular, but kids and women and country. We've seen now this, I think for the clearest time ever, our relationship with the United States and just what subservient relationship we have with the United States and how dangerous some of these forces that we used to think were sort of good, an international rules-based order, all this kind of patter. You need to have this is good for you. Like, we've seen the reality, the mask ripped off some of these powers. And we're beginning to see how the world works, I think, much more clearly than we maybe did 5 years ago. Right now, there's a big national push to try and get a handful of multinational gas corporations that are making obscene profits from the illegal war, using our public resources to pay a fair share of tax. And it looks like even with a campaign that's connecting to millions of people across the country, war profiteering with public resources, it looks like that's still not going to move these people to do the right thing. And we're asking ourselves, well, why are weapons companies making a killing right now? Why is the coal and gas lobby making a killing right now? Why are we paying for all of this? Why can't we afford the things that we desperately need? Our homes and public transport and going to see a doctor when we need it. Why is all this unaffordable, but suddenly there's $1.5 trillion for the US military, or $375 billion for nuclear submarines, or, we don't want to threaten the gas corporations and take their obscene profits off them. And I think we're beginning to, realise that there's a whole lot of lies being told to us about the way power works in this country. And a whole lot of lies are being told in the drug space to keep the profits up for pharmaceutical industry, to keep the police powers in place, to run a political play against political opponents. And it would be unusual, wouldn't it, if they're just lying to us in one corner. It turns out they're lying to us in a whole bunch of different places. And I really do get to think that the public is beginning to see. The mask has been torn down and we're beginning to see the way the 1% is running this world. And I'm hopeful that as we start joining the dots, that a whole lot of these generational struggles will sort of come forward and we're going to start winning. So I'm hopeful. I'm actually hopeful, despite the nature of the world at the moment.
Got to be hopeful. We've got to be hopeful. That's the whole point, isn't it? Being hopeful and moving forward. We have run out of time. We can continue the... I'm sorry, if you have one more question, I can't... Yes, good. Go ahead then, please.
G'day. So specifically on cannabis and One Nation, I suppose. Following the talk from the chap from America before, talking about the movement there with Trump and even the conservatives or maybe the alt-right like Joe Rogan kind of pushing that more in that landscape. I suppose it's interesting seeing from the collapse of the two-party system a lot of those voters going over to One Nation, obviously I would say misguided in many ways. When you talk to an average One Nation voter on the booth during a pre-poll or whatever, often legalisation of cannabis seems like something where there's a real agreeable point. There's mass support for it in amongst the public now. I suppose you would imagine One Nation would be treading carefully where they don't want to be speaking too outwardly against this out of fear of alienating that component of their base. With that pressure on the two-party system, with them seeing the risk of votes flowing away from them on this, where does One Nation, alongside obviously the Greens spearheading this push, come into the conversation on both a national and state level?
One Nation opposed and voted against legalising cannabis. Like they opposed it, they attacked us for doing it, and they voted against it. And they've got a pattern of doing that across the country. They cheer in Donald Trump and his wars, and then they run a campaign against the terrible cost of fuel. Like, great war, pity about the cost of fuel. One Nation talk about how, the elite and drain the swamp, and then they fly around in a plane gifted to them by the richest woman in the country. Like, it is interesting watching the way they just seem to have no sense of their own deep hypocrisy. And I suppose one of the benefits they have from being a totally unprincipled party is they don't have to pretend to be coherent, right? They just feed on grievance and all of these things. But I do think, highlighting their voting record, voting against legalising cannabis, their voting record, they never want to increase the tax on corporations, their voting record of, wanting to give every single new power they possibly can to police or ASIO or the security agencies. They love that stuff, right? They love giving them all power. Like when people at the moment don't want that. If anyone's out there waiting for One Nation to come and save them on drug law reform, One Nation's going to come and kick your door in with an armed security force and take you off to a secret prison and disappear you for the next 24 hours. That's what One Nation will do. So they're not a valid, if they do suddenly have flip and vote to support legalised cannabis, I'll take their votes, right? But they're far more likely not to flip to vote legalised cannabis, to flip to vote to put someone in jackboots to knock down your wall and arrest you because you said the wrong thing. So,
On the basis that those laws apply to other people, not themselves. It's always the way. Always the way.
Well, if you want the answer for why politicians do this crap all the time, why they're happy to give the extreme powers to police, why they're happy to build new jails, why they're happy to, defund public schools, why they're happy to do all of this stuff, is because they feel pretty sure that it's not going to be their kids that it's applying to. Their kids somehow won't go to the jail. Their kids will have a good lawyer. Their kids will go to a good school. Their kids will have an out. Their friends' kids will have an out. They feel pretty secure in this whole stuff. It's about policing an underclass that they see. And that's one of the most dangerous things with our politics at the moment, this division between the political class and the people who they see as an underclass, and they're willing to do this too.
We have run out of time. Thank you, David.